Well, I think that it's important to talk to people you disagree with, debate and hash out some of the ideas that we have and the differences we have. I'm not afraid of my political views. I'm not afraid to admit when maybe I got something wrong in the past and maybe I've evolved on my political views. It's just really, really important in a functioning democracy to have Americans see one another as fellow Americans as opposed to an identity that needs to be super combative with a different identity. And I think that's what we've kind of turned into. You and I clearly have a lot of disagreements on policy, disagreements on culture, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're an awful person. It doesn't mean that I should be afraid of you. If anything, I should prove that I genuinely believe my political views by engaging in these debates. If I can defend what I believe with actual facts, statistics, empirical evidence, well, that only proves that there's good reason to believe in the policies that I'm promoting. And it's easy to be in an echo chamber where everyone already agrees with you, but you're not really being challenged. So I like to be challenged. I like to put my political ideas to the test, and I think this is a good opportunity to do it.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I really like about you as a person. We actually got to know each other when we did a debate about a year ago, I think, over in Pennsylvania, and we were talking in the green room beforehand, and we got along as human beings. And one of the things that's nice about conversations like this is, again, what you say I think is super important, which is that the social fabric of the country is going to be built on the idea that people can have conversations like this, and yet it's considered so unusual and so crazy. Have you gotten any blowback for being willing to do conversations like this one?
I have. I will say, it is a small portion of a very loud group of self-identified leftists on Twitter, for instance. They'll get very upset. They'll accuse me of platforming you, even though, I don't know if they notice, you've got a bit of a platform on your own. I don't need to help you in building a platform or platforming you. I think that there's this very real fear that in engaging in these conversations, you are legitimizing the other side. And my point is, as long as the other side's coming at me with good faith arguments, they genuinely believe what they're saying, having these debates is important in actually deciphering what you as the viewer believe, right? Because if you're only listening to one side, if you're listening to leftist media, liberal media, and you don't get the other side at all, your policy ideas are never going to be challenged. You're not going to hear the other side. And I think it's led to this culture right now where Americans overwhelmingly seem to have difficulty with nuance, right? Everything needs to be black and white. And honestly, political issues are usually a lot more complex, a lot more nuanced, and nothing in life is black and white.
And that's what makes them interesting in the first place.
Right.
If it was all that black and white or that easy, you wouldn't have to listen to shows like yours or shows like mine, and you wouldn't have to, I've always encouraged people to listen to shows that are on the other side of the aisle, because otherwise they don't know what I'm saying that's fact and what I'm saying that's opinion. And so I think it's really important for people to hear conversations between people who really, really disagree. You used a phrase there that I think is really important, good faith. And this is one that I've had to kind of think through myself, because obviously there are conversations that are not worth having. You'll have people online who will say, you should go talk to this person. This person happens to be, like dregs of the earth. And then you say, well, I don't really wish to talk to, and they say, well, you say you're willing to talk to pretty much anybody. So how do you draw that line? How do you draw the line between somebody who is worth talking to, somebody who's acting in good faith, and somebody who's not really acting in good faith?
Well, I think the interaction that you and I had both before and during that debate was really important to me in that it gave me a better idea and sense of who you are. One of the issues I've had in recent years is the the caricatures that are drawn of the other side. And I think the left does it, the right does it. So just kind of like lumping you in with, let's say, Tucker Carlson, lumping you in with, I don't know, someone else that I certainly don't think is coming at these debates from a good faith perspective. They're looking for clicks. They're looking to build their public persona. There's a lot of that going on. You're a pretty respectful person when we're engaging in these debates. I don't really see you trying to draw caricatures of me as we're in the middle of these conversations. So to me, that's important. You can just tell there's like toxicity, and then there are people that you disagree with politically, but you can actually have a respectful conversation with them. And because I had that experience with you, I was comfortable, again, having this experience today in hashing out our differences, but also talking about where there might be some similarities, where we want the country to go. because this country's always had a variety of political ideas, political differences, but there was a time in America where people could engage in these debates, engage in these conversations, and leave feeling that mutual respect for one another, seeing each other as fellow Americans, as opposed to my enemy, the other side. We need to, crush them. We need to do that. I want to move away from that. And honestly, during the coronavirus pandemic, I've opened my mind up to some programming that I otherwise wouldn't have listened to. So, for instance, there's this show called The John and Ken Show. It airs in LA, but I think it's actually syndicated all over the country. And I like listening to it because there are a lot of perspectives in that show that I disagree with. But there have been moments where one of the hosts will say something that in the short term I might be offended by or angry about or whatever, but I have to do my due diligence. So I'll investigate it a little bit and think to myself, oh, well, actually, he had a point there. So I think the necessity for nuclear energy is a good example of that. Once I realized right now the technology for renewables isn't quite where we need it to be, where we can just give up fossil fuels and be okay. Well, a good clean energy solution to kind of close that gap, at least for now, would be nuclear. And you say that, and a lot of people on the left have a negative reaction to it. But I think it's partly because they're not typically exposed to other perspectives. Everyone's kind of in their own ideological bubble. It's a huge problem, in my opinion, and that's why I want to have conversations.
I mean, that's a great example. So I've always used nuclear energy as actually the litmus test on people who take climate change seriously. There are people on both sides who don't, right? There are people on the right who will say that it doesn't exist, that there has been no global warming over the course of the last 100 years, or who say that there is no anthropogenic global warming. It's entirely the fault of the sun. And my perspective has always been, I don't have the expertise to challenge the IPCC when they suggest that there will be a certain amount of climate change. Their sort of outlying, more extreme predictions are the ones that have sort of the least predictability, and they admit that. And so the question becomes, what do we do in order to prevent as much of this as possible while still maintaining a lifestyle that Westerners are used to and that we should aspire to for the rest of the world? And nuclear energy has always been a great way of doing that. And so that perspective has tended to draw fire from both sides. You have people who say, well, why are you even acknowledging that this sort of thing is, that you sound like Greta Thunberg? And then you'll have people on the left saying, well, how he doesn't even believe in global warming because he is advocating for nuclear energy. That sort of failure of nuance, I think, has really deleterious effects because it prevents us from accomplishing solutions that, if you and I can agree on a thing, it's a pretty good notion that that's a fairly commonsensical thing, because we disagree on so many things. And if we can agree on something like nuclear energy, then really there's not that much to argue about.
And I mean, nuclear energy does not emit the type of climate emissions, climate-causing emissions that other fossil fuel, oil, natural gas, that definitely does have an impact. It contributes to the climate emergency. So anyone who is against nuclear energy, I think there are some points that are legitimate. So for instance, people are concerned about another Chernobyl. I totally understand that. But the technology has improved since then, better safeguards.
Not run by the communist Russians. Yes.
Yeah. But look, these are conversations that should be had, and we should be fearless in having these conversations. I feel confident in my beliefs and my values, but I also really want to get into basically a culture that leaves ego aside and helps people feel comfortable acknowledging when, hey, maybe I didn't get something right. Because there are certainly areas where, turns out, I didn't get something right. I used to be 100% against nuclear. I thought nuclear would be super dangerous. I totally bought into like the Chernobyl related.
Yeah, exactly.
But once you start reading into it a little more, once you actually start thinking for yourself independently, independent of some ideological model that you're supposed to fit into perfectly, it really does open your horizons, and it allows for you to learn. And that's what I want to do. I want to learn, and I want to make sure that the information I'm getting to my audience is well thought out and accurate.
So, I think what's really interesting about that is that it seems like there are two values that you're centering in on, and they're working in tandem, which are really good. One is that you're actually pursuing things that you think are true. You're trying to get to the truth, which means listening to other perspectives, just from a sort of classically liberal position. And then on the other hand, you're also suggesting that this builds social fabric. And so the point that I've made is that the future of the country, in terms of sort of a national polity, because what we're seeing right now is a giant sort, right? We're seeing people like me move to Florida, away from California. You're still in California. We'll talk about that in a second. You're seeing people in New York get more New York, and people in California get more California, and Florida get more Florida. It's getting redder. And so the social fabric at the national level seems to be fraying a lot. And so one of the things that I've said is that the future of the country is going to rely on people who disagree with me, but agree that we should be having the conversation.
Right.
Not siding with people who they may agree with in terms of the political end goal, but foreclose the conversation. Because that way, the social fabric phrase, you get to where you want to go, maybe, but you lose half the country in the process.
You might lose half the country in the short term, right? But I think media is incredibly powerful. And look, I think it's also important to differentiate between what you and I are doing and what I see happening on other, let's say, right-wing shows, right? I see a lot of right-wing hosts bring on individuals who purport to be on the left, and then all they do is come on the show and trash the left while simultaneously agree with whatever the right-wing host is saying, right? It's a form of propaganda that I think is persuading some amount of leftists to immediately panic if they see someone on the left go on a right-wing show. So I'm sure that they'll see this conversation, they'll automatically assume, oh, Anna's just there to...
Right, welcome to the Republican Party, Anna.
Right, to reinforce what Ben is saying. But you and I have serious differences. You know, we've debated economic issues. Everyone can go back and watch that debate that we had at the Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce. But at the same time, I think there is a difference between the endlessly... I don't want to say sometimes violent, yes. Like, we just need to bring the temperature down for a second and acknowledge that the majority of the country isn't on the extreme right or the extreme left. The conversation is dominated on social media, especially by the extreme right and the extreme left. We need to bring the temperature down and actually represent what the majority of Americans are concerned about. Majority of Americans want the same thing. They want healthy, happy families. They want financial stability. How do we get there? And we're never going to answer that question if all we do is pretend like the extreme ends of the spectrum are representative of this country and that we should all hate each other and be super divided.